مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. في الأيام الخوالي كان الجمهوريون والديمقراطيون يتقاتلون بالضراوة حيال ما يتعلق بالسياسة الداخلية، لكنهم تعاونوا مع بعضهم البعض بشكل عام عندما كان الأمر يتعلق بقضايا الحرب والسلام والسياسة الخارجية. انتهى هذا الأمر قبل نحو 25 عاما بعد انهيار الاتحاد السوفيتي وانتهاء الحرب الباردة وزوال الخطر الداهم الذي وهد الأمريكيين. منذ ذلك الحين الحرب والسلام كان جزءا من نقاشنا السياسي، مثل الضرائب والإنقاذ والرعاية الصحية. في الوقت الحالي هذه القضايا هي على رأس جدول أعمال الرئيس. داعش، أوكرانيا، الصين، إيران، كل واحدة منها هي بمثابة مشكلة ضخمة ومعقدة، ويمكن أن تؤثر في مسير رئاسة بايدن. Welcome back to داخل Washington. Politics used to stop at the water's edge. It doesn't anymore. So this week on Dakhel Washington, with my guests David Drucker and Minnie Racker, we're going to take a look at the domestic politics of urgent foreign policy issues. Now, war and peace is usually at the top of the agenda. President Biden has ruled out direct engagement of U.S. troops, but he is shoring up neighboring NATO allies and has threatened Russia with massive sanctions. How is the administration's approach playing politically? David?
Well, it's a really good question, Robert. You know, one of the reasons Joe Biden was elected in 2020 was because in the middle and the soft right, if you will, Republicans, but not super partisan Republicans, there was a desire for more a foreign policy leadership from the White House that in their view would be more competent, more steady, and more that would show more U.S. loyalty to our allies, and less of the sort of freelancing and friction that was exhibited by Donald Trump. Friction not just with adversaries, but with allies, particularly in Europe. And the Biden administration and the new president, got off to a rocky start with a very chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan, and is now faced with sort of multiple crises to deal with, because we have the Asian theater with Chinese threats against Taiwan, not to mention their growing presence in the Pacific. And while the president's initial approach to dealing with Vladimir Putin and his threats against Ukraine were not very well received by foreign policy thinkers and analysts, right and left, in the United States, the president's sort of stiffening spine, if you will, and more clear and determined rhetoric has begun to win over both some critics as well as fans of Joe Biden, but fans that were concerned that he wasn't approaching the Russians with the sort of resolve that is necessary in order to deal with essentially a quasi-dictator like Vladimir Putin, given his history. And, you know, look, we know that the Russians basically invaded and stole Ukraine, and that's why many people have referred to his new threats as an additional invasion. And so in the past few days, what we've seen from President Joe Biden is more direct leadership in Europe with our European allies, and in a sense, not just asking them what they're willing to do, but sort of subtly telling them what they're going to do. We've seen that with Germany and the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. And we've seen a lot more direct language when it comes to the messages he is sending to Vladimir Putin, in terms of that is doing a good bit to improve his position politically in the United States, if not writ large with voters, because his approval numbers are still very low, but with the sort of commentariat that can often set the agenda and opinions on foreign policy matters. And that can be very helpful to him because a weak U.S. president always has trouble rallying our allies abroad and keeping our adversaries at bay. And so this is a very interesting few weeks for Joe Biden, and it's been very interesting to watch a sort of mini evolution on his part.
So if David is saying that President Biden is earning some respect from people in Washington for taking a relatively stiff and strong response to what we see in Russia, Ukraine, Minnie, how are progressives in the Democratic Party viewing this? Normally, they're a bit, shall we say, gun shy about engaging in tough talk against foreign leaders. Are they shoulder to shoulder with the Ukrainians or keeping quiet?
I would say progressives right now, this is not, the top issue. They're not necessarily going after Biden for this right now, but you still do see a lot of Republicans going after Biden for this. So I would say that's the main pushback he's getting, where you have folks like Tom Cotton saying that President Biden isn't doing enough, isn't standing strong enough against
Republican senator from Arkansas. Yes.
Right, that's correct. And then you've also got a subset of the Republican Party that is still affected by the way Trump approached foreign policy, where you have say Senator Josh Hawley, who says, okay, maybe we should stay out of this more, maybe we shouldn't, keep the door open for Ukraine to join NATO. And he kind of represents a segment of the Republican base here that's still sticking with Trump's, America first, isolationist, let's stay out of it foreign policy. So I'd say that's where the criticism is coming from mostly.
So let me just ask about this, David. I mean, there are some on the right, like popular TV personality Tucker Carlson on Fox News, who actually is making sympathetic noises about Russia, not about Ukraine. How is that possible in America in 2022?
Yeah, to say the least, sympathetic noises toward Russia. Look, Minnie is very correct to point out that Joe Biden continues to be criticized heavily from Republicans. He continues to receive heavy criticism from Republicans in Washington that are elected Republicans. Republican senators say that he is far too weak. His weakness on the world stage has emboldened our adversaries. There's a case to make that because of how he handled the withdrawal from Afghanistan, he, in a sense, precipitated Vladimir Putin believing that he was dealing with a weak president and could do whatever he wanted in Eastern Europe and make these threats toward Ukraine and win major concessions. But she is also correct, and it's important to understand that in the Trump era, the era of former President Donald Trump, since he rose to the head of the Republican Party in 2016, Republicans have had a much larger internal argument about their approach to foreign policy and what it should be, right? So for the Ronald Reagan era that lasted from about 1980 all the way until about 2016, the Republican Party was generally a very hawkish party that believed in projecting American military power abroad, if not in a kinetic military action as a way to deter adversaries from making bold threats and bold moves of their own. And what we have seen since Donald Trump won the Republican nomination and was elected president in 2016 is a much bigger debate where the populists inside the Republican Party that were always in partner with the conservatives have now a much bigger voice. And the populists have always been and still are very skeptical of American military action. They aren't interested in projecting American military power overseas. They're suspicious of American alliances, despite the success that the North Atlantic Treaty Organization has had for all of these decades. And so what we have seen from them regarding Joe Biden and foreign policy, and particularly in this Russia-Ukraine imbroglio, is on the one hand, you're too weak and your weakness invites Russian aggression, not to mention Chinese aggression. But on the other hand, we don't want to do anything about it. Which I would say, interestingly enough, coming out of the Trump era, you have a little bit more sympathy for taking tough action against the Russians in the Democratic Party than you had previously.
All right. When we come back after the break, we're going to move from Russia-Ukraine to how are these issues playing domestically, if they're playing at all, in just a moment. I remember it like yesterday. I was sitting in my freshman dormitory at college with 20 other young guys, peering into a small black and white television to follow one of the most heroic chapters of America's Olympic history, the semifinals of the 1980 men's hockey competition, which pit the United States versus the Soviet Union. This was the height of the Cold War, you have to remember, and the Soviets had just invaded Afghanistan. Later that year, the United States would lead a boycott of the Summer Olympics in Moscow. But the Winter Olympics that year were held in the small upstate New York town of Lake Placid. And the highlight was watching a group of upstart underdog American collegiate hockey players defeat the four-time gold medal winners from the evil Soviet Union. The final score was 4-3, setting up the Americans' gold medal victory over Finland 2 days later. They never should have won. The victory over the Soviets was labeled a miracle on ice. Read about it in Wayne Coffey's 2005 book, The Boys of Winter, the untold story of a coach, a dream, and the 1980 Olympic hockey team, or watch the heart-thumping 2004 film titled Miracle, starring Kurt Russell as U.S. coach Herb Brooks. The Winter Olympics never felt so good. Again, my guests today include David Drucker. David is the senior political correspondent for the Washington Examiner. David is the author of the new book, In Trump's Shadow, The Battle for 2024 and the Future of the GOP. Also joining us is Minnie Racker. Minnie is staff correspondent at National Journal, where she covers the intersection of politics and culture, as well as the progressive movement. She writes weekly long-form features on national politics, shorter profiles on personalities, hearings, and trends on Capitol Hill and around our nation's capital. And David, you mentioned the Reagan era. It was back even in the Carter era that we did a boycott of the Olympics in Moscow in summer of 1980. That was a full boycott. That following the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan.
You know, in 1980, when we engaged in a full boycott of the Moscow Olympics, it was over Russia's invasion, the USSR's invasion of Afghanistan. 4 years later, they paid us back by boycotting the Los Angeles Olympics. But everything was a lot simpler back then in retrospect, because the Soviet Union was not an economic power, it was a military power. And we did not have, nor did American businesses have, extensive ties to the Soviet Union or firms or companies or manufacturers in the Soviet Union, for all the reasons that we're aware of.
All right, so foreign policy, important, but not top of the agenda. Minnie, David, thank you very much for joining us this week on Dakhel, Washington. Also joining us is Juan Zarate, one of our nation's leading national security experts. Juan is global managing partner of K2 Integrity, a risk management firm. He's also chairman of the Center on Economic and Financial Power and senior national security analyst for NBC News. Juan served in the George W. Bush administration, holding the titles of Deputy Assistant to the President and Deputy National Security Advisor for combating terrorism. Is there something that we can do to impress upon the Chinese at this moment?
For those who follow sanctions, there's still much to be done in terms of the convergence of activities that not just the Russians are engaged in, but that the Chinese are engaged in. We have a full sanctions regime around corruption and human rights. This might actually be an interesting moment to begin to unleash some of those sanctions against some Chinese targets as a bit of a brushback, as we say in the United States, a way of demonstrating that the U.S. is still paying attention to Russian targets, can apply sanctions where they may be effective, and that we haven't forgotten that China presents particular risks and challenges.
Fascinating. I'm afraid I need to cut us off here. I apologize. Again, my guests today include Danny Glazer. Danny spent 13 years at the Treasury Department fighting terrorist financing and illicit criminal money flows. Also joining him is Catherine Bauer. Kate Bauer is my colleague at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Previously, she served at the Treasury Department, including as financial attaché in Abu Dhabi and Jerusalem. When one reads news stories and you see that we've imposed thousands of sanctions, 3,000, 5,000 sanctions against governments, individuals, corporations, institutions, this is a huge undertaking. So let's peel this back a little bit to help explain what some of this means for our viewers. So Kate, who makes these decisions in the U.S. government to begin with? Who's responsible for this sanctions process?
And that's really all housed within the Treasury Department in the U.S. And one thing that makes it unique is the U.S. Treasury Department is the only finance ministry in the world to have a fully integrated element of the intelligence community within it, as well as the Office of Foreign Assets Control, that helps kind of marshal all of this financial information and support policymakers in understanding these relationships and where to target sanctions as well.
So if it's the Treasury that makes these decisions, or certainly the implementation and the intelligence behind it, Danny, there are so many different laws and presidential directives that govern this. Is there a hierarchy? Is there a single piece that is more important than any other that governs how the United States goes about making these decisions?
Well, the most important law that governs sanctions is called the International Economic Emergency Powers Act, IEPA. And what IEPA does is it gives the authority to the President of the United States to declare a national emergency. That's a term of art. The president could declare a national emergency with respect to situations that the common person on the street might not regard necessarily as a national emergency. A crisis in Zimbabwe might rise to the level of a national emergency for IEPA purposes. But once the president declares a national emergency under IEPA, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, the president would then identify the parameters of a sanctions program. So he might declare a national emergency with respect to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and then authorize the Treasury Department and the State Department or whatever agencies he likes. It would normally be the Treasury Department to implement that sanctions program. And so most of the sanctions programs, other than the ones that are required by Congress, would be implemented through IEPA. And so when we talk about Iran, when we talk about Russia, when we talk about North Korea, when we talk about Venezuela, most of these sanctions are implemented through IEPA.
And is it the Treasury's intelligence assets that give us the information to be able to sanction thousands of different people and corporations and industries and governments and institutions? Danny?
Well, Kate is correct. Treasury is the U.S. Treasury Department is the only finance ministry in the world that has a fully integrated Intelligence Analysis Office. I think it's important to underscore, Rob, that the Treasury Department does not collect intelligence in the traditional sense of the term. So the Treasury Department has access to information that's collected by the U.S. intelligence community, the NSA, the CIA, all the different portions of the intelligence community. Plus, it works closely with U.S. law enforcement agencies who also have access to a lot of information. Plus, Treasury has its own information that it has through non-traditional intelligence means, just its knowledge of the financial system, its knowledge of banks, its knowledge of how the economy works.
All right, we're going to have to hold it there. This is a fascinating discussion. I want to thank you both, Kate Bauer, Danny Glazer, for joining me on Dakhel, Washington. My father was born 101 years ago in a small village called Shenderivka in the governorate of Kiev in what is now Ukraine. When he was 2, he and his family were smuggled out of the country by an uncle who had come to America before World War I to make his fortune, and returned when he received a letter from his sister, my grandmother, to rescue her family from the terrible hardships of life in the early years of the Soviet Union. My father and his family arrived in 1923 with legal visas in hand and started a new life in America. The fact that there are 25 or so children and grandchildren of my father and his brother who now live as free men and women is the result of that brave flight from Ukraine a century ago. Watching events unfold in Ukraine today, I think of my father's story. I remember once suggesting to my dad that we take a roots trip back to Ukraine to visit Shenderivka and see where he came from, where his grandparents are buried. The look on his face forever stuck with me. "Are you crazy?" he said to me. "We almost died getting out of there. Now you want to go back? No way. I'm going to Florida," which is what he did. Today, the people of Ukraine don't want to leave. They just want Russia to leave them alone. This is perhaps the most black and white conflict since Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. The aggressor has no possible justification. He is just being a bully. And while no foreign army is likely to fight to expel Russia from Ukraine, the way the United States led an international coalition to expel Saddam, Putin will be no less able to swallow and digest Ukraine than Saddam was able to swallow and digest Kuwait. Putin's Russia is bigger than Saddam's Iraq, but Putin, like Saddam before him, is a fundamentally weak leader who governs not by elevating the energies of his people to advance the common good, but by running the machine of dictatorship off the fumes of glories past. When the foreign minister of Putin's one ally, China, recently declared that every country's territorial integrity deserves to be respected, including Ukraine's, it underscores how lonely it can get in the Kremlin. So far, I believe President Biden has handled this crisis well, far better, in my view, than the Afghan withdrawal last August. Hopefully, his wise and wily maneuvering will convince Putin of the inherent folly in invading his proud and increasingly nationalistic neighbor. If it doesn't, and Putin's pride won't let him back down from this disastrous adventure, we must stand firm, provide the Ukrainians with means for their defense, punish Russia mercilessly, and keep the allies together to ensure the Russian bear doesn't sense openings elsewhere. In the meantime, I count my blessings that my parents and grandparents escaped Russia's tender embrace when they could. بهذا نصل لنهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة، وخاصة حول تأثير الأزمة الأوكرانية على الصين وإيران، أرجو أن تتواصلوا معي عبر تويتر على هاشتاج Inside Washington أو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على @RobSatloff. سأراكم الأسبوع المقبل وإلى أن ألقاكم شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.